let us consider the women of Karbala. They had shared with Imam Husayn and the rest of the company all the hardships of the journey traveling across the desert, the deprivation of water and all that that meant. And yet they shared something even greater. They had to bear the burden of trying to comfort the children who had no water, who were suffering from the desert journey. Imagine the anguish of a mother who cannot produce sufficient milk to feed her baby because she herself is suffering from such terrible thirst. So we see in the women of the company of Imam Husayn great courage and commitment and dedication. They shared with him the commitment of the journey and of the faith. They were not accompanying him just by chance. They too were wanting to journey with him in complete faith and trust in God, so that they would keep alive the message of Islam. There were 8 mothers who were present on the field of Karbala. 8 mothers who saw their sons die on that day. The women had the responsibility of preparing their menfolk for battle. They had to dress them in their armor. They had to arm them and send them out in the certain knowledge that they were sending them out to their death. They were sending them out to die as martyrs. And so there is this extraordinary tension between the natural compassion of the mother who sees her son, of the sister who sees her brother going forward to their death. And that then is balanced by the woman of faith who sees their beloved man or boy going forward to become a martyr, to make the ultimate sacrifice, that they would live their life and they would die in total submission to God, full of faith and full of trust. And so we find these 2 elements constantly at play in the women of Karbala. The women who would spend their time in prayer while the men were in the field of battle. The women who would receive back the bodies of those who had died. Now, to die in such a battle leaves a body mutilated, butchered, full of cuts, severed limbs, sometimes beheaded. And yet here were the women who would receive them back with love and with rejoicing, with the natural love of a mother for her son, and with rejoicing of a woman of faith. For here again was another martyr who had answered the supreme call, the call of God, not to desert the Imam, not to desert the way of truth. We're told the story of one man who was accompanied by his wife and by his mother. His name was Abdullah. And he took permission from Imam Husayn to go into the field of battle and there to engage the enemy in fighting. He lost his life. He was killed in the field of battle, and his body was struck down and lay bleeding in the sand. His wife ran to the body of her dead husband, and she threw herself over his body. And she said, "I rejoice that you are now have the crown of paradise, and I pray God that I will be allowed to join you there too. And at this, one of the commanders of the Umayyad army gave the signal that she too should be killed, and her body fell dead over that of her dead husband, and she became the only woman martyr on the field of Karbala. And when the mother saw what had become of her son and of his wife, she too took up the fight, and she ran toward the enemy with a tent pole, and she would strike them down. But she was called back by Imam Husayn, and in obedience she returned back into the encampment. And there was another man on this day, and his name was Umar. His mother was also there present, watching the death of her son. And after he had been killed, his head was cut off, and then someone picked it up and threw it toward the camp. His mother ran out, picked up the head of her dead son, dusted the sand from it, and then she threw it back. You shall have him all of him was given in sacrifice, in martyrdom for the way of God. And then she too would have joined in the battle, were it not for the fact that Imam Husayn again ordered her back. And so here were the women who had not only suffered the hardships of the journey, they had suffered that awesome reality of seeing all the men of the company of Imam Husayn die. The companions, the family, and ultimately the Imam himself. What then was to become of them? Would they too be killed? Would they be violated? What was to happen to them? We know that some of the men from the Umayyad army raced into the camp and started pillaging from the possessions there and started abusing the women. And in the end, they were ordered to stop. This is unacceptable. And they were ordered to leave and depart from the tents so that the women would have some degree of safety. And they gathered together there around Lady Zainab, the sister of Imam Husayn, so that she became the focal point of strength for the women of that company, for the children who had survived, and of course for the future Imam Zain al-Abidin, the one remaining son of the Prophet, the one remaining son of Imam Husayn, who had been too ill to engage in the fighting that day, who had been nursed by Lady Zainab during the awesome battle itself. And she now became that great rock of stability for the remainder of the company of Husayn. All the bodies of the dead were beheaded. Their heads were raised on spears, and they were taken off in the direction of Kufa. All the survivors, the women and the children, were made to go toward Kufa also, with the awesome sight of the heads of their beloved menfolk paraded on sticks in front of them, the women were denigrated. They were debased by the way that they were treated. They were deprived of any outer dignity, but only outer dignity, because within they still had the strength of their character, the strength of their faith and commitment. The day was not yet over for the women of Karbala. We know that when the women were brought into the marketplace, all the people were there in Kufa. They were looking on, and they were feeling within themselves the anguish of, what have we done? What have we done? Here are the heads of the Imam and of his family and of his companions, and here are the women and children of his company who have been degraded and are brought through our presence in this way. What have we done? And we know that they come into the presence of the governor, and that ridicule is placed upon those who have died. But again, Lady Zainab is firm and strong. She is the one who stands up to speak to the governor, to tell him that they will not be defeated, that martyrdom is a joy and is a prize that was given to those who have died. They were in the path of right, and it was the Umayyad soldiers who were in the path of wrong. The story then, of course, continues, because the severed heads and the captives were taken from Kufa all the way to Damascus. And they were taken by a route that led them to different villages along the way, so that everybody could see that the power of the Umayyads reigned in that land, that the Ahl al-Bayt, the family of the Prophet, were here destroyed. But of course, the Umayyads didn't reckon with the strength of the women, with the strength of Lady Zainab holding them all together. And she it was who led them with dignity through the depravity of their treatment, all the way to Damascus, where she entered into the court of Yazid. And it was in the court of Yazid that she stood and declared to him that he was in error, that he could not possibly match the nobility, the faith, the courage, and the dignity of Imam Husayn and his companions. It was she who was prepared to sacrifice her life in order to save the new Imam, Zayn al-Abidin. It was she who was prepared to take a stand to defend the dignity of one of the young daughters of Imam Husayn, when a man in the community sitting there began to look at her and to desire her and to ask Yazid if he could have her for himself. It was Lady Zainab who kept that community strong in their captivity in Damascus. It was she eventually who would lead them with their heads held in dignity to return to Medina. And it was she who requested and persevered with the request that she should be allowed to go with that company, and on the journey to Medina they should divert to Karbala. And it was in Karbala that Lady Zainab led the first ziyarat, the first visitation to the graves of the martyrs of Karbala, and it was she who established the pattern for the faithful who would follow her, men and women, afterwards, to visit there the graves of those who had died, to keep alive their memory, and to rededicate herself and them to the way of God.